4 days. That's how long it took searchers in Sarasota, Florida to find her. 4 days of vigils, of volunteers walking grid patterns through scrubland, of a community staring at a grainy piece of security footage that would end up circling the entire country before the search was even over. Because this case didn't start with a missing persons flyer, it started with a video. This is a true crime documentary, and this is the story of Carlie Brucia. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe. We cover cases like this every week. An ordinary Sunday, February 1st, 2004, was Super Bowl Sunday. Across the country, people were setting out chip bowls, testing speaker systems, and turning on televisions for a matchup between the New England Patriots and the Carolina Panthers. It was the kind of evening that felt, by design, safe and small. Errands finished early, dinner plans built around kickoff, whole neighborhoods indoors and half distracted. In Sarasota, an 11-year-old girl named Carlie Brucia had spent the evening at a friend's house nearby. Court records would later fix the time precisely. She left sometime between 6:10 and 6:15 in the evening to walk home, a route she had taken plenty of times before. To save a few minutes, she cut behind Evie's car wash on Bee Ridge Road. A shortcut, not a detour, the kind every kid in a familiar neighborhood has. It was early evening, still light enough, still populated enough, that nothing about the walk should have felt dangerous. Sarasota is not the kind of city where a child vanishes from behind a car wash on a Sunday. Carlie never made it home. Her parents noticed almost immediately. Within half an hour of her disappearance, they had already begun calling around, and police were notified the same night. There was no gap of hours where a family assumed a child was simply late. The alarm went up fast, which meant investigators were on the ground while the trail was still warm. It didn't matter. Whoever had taken Carlie had already vanished with her. The video what followed, in the earliest hours, looked like most missing child cases. Officers canvassing the friend's house, the route home, the surrounding blocks, flashlights through hedges. Neighbors pulled from their Super Bowl parties to answer questions at their front doors. But Sarasota County detectives had one advantage most investigations don't get this early: a business with a working security camera positioned squarely over the spot where Carlie was last seen. The camera showed something that stopped the investigation cold. The footage is short, and it is exactly as disquieting on the 100th viewing as the first. A man is seen approaching Carlie from behind. He reaches out, takes her by the wrist, and leads her away, off camera, in under a minute. There is no chase. There is no visible struggle that plays out on frame. Her expression, visible for only a few seconds, shows no recognition of him at all. The blank, uncertain look of a child being spoken to by someone she doesn't know, not yet understanding what is happening to her. Investigators released the footage to the media the following evening, and an Amber Alert went out for Carlie across the state. What happened next was less like a regional manhunt and more like a wave. Within hours, the video was airing on every major cable news network in the country: CNN, Fox, MSNBC, local affiliates in cities that had never heard of Sarasota. A child being taken, captured in real time, with no face clearly visible, and no name attached to the man doing it. For 2 days, the country searched for a stranger. Tip lines lit up nationwide. People who had never set foot in Florida found themselves staring at a few seconds of grainy footage on a loop, trying to place a build, a gate, a uniform. It is hard to overstate how unusual this was for 2004, a pre-smartphone, pre-social media era, where a single piece of surveillance video could still travel that far, that fast, and hold an entire news cycle hostage for days. A name surfaces. The break came not from a tip line exactly, but from someone who recognized a way of moving. A woman who had once worked alongside a local mechanic named Joseph P. Smith saw the footage on television and told her husband she was certain the man in the video was Smith. The build, the tattoos, the particular way he carried himself, all matched what she remembered. It's a detail that sits at the strange intersection of true crime cases like this one. The technology that cracks a case is often less important than a single person's memory of a co-worker's walk. Her husband, when first approached, pushed back on the timeline. He told detectives Smith had borrowed his car that evening and hadn't returned it until the following morning, an alibi offered almost reflexively, the kind of statement meant to explain a friend's whereabouts. Instead, it did the opposite. It placed Smith's movements squarely inside the window investigators were already building around the abduction, with access to a vehicle and no clear account of where he'd been. Smith, 37 at the time of the crime, was not a stranger to the justice system. He was a father of 3, a former auto mechanic, and a man with a long record of drug-related arrests stretching back years. He had also, in earlier cases, been accused of serious violent crimes and walked away from them. In one, he was acquitted of kidnapping a 20-year-old woman. In another, he resolved a charge that he'd struck a woman with a motorcycle helmet by pleading no contest and serving a short county jail sentence. Across that decade-plus history, Smith had served roughly a year and a half of actual prison time, almost entirely on drug possession and fraud charges. At the time Carlie disappeared, Smith was on probation for a cocaine conviction, and critically, he should not have been free at all. He had already violated the terms of that probation. But rather than being returned to custody for it, a judge had declined to jail him, citing a few $100s in unpaid court costs, and the legal principle that Florida does not operate debtors' prisons. The idea that a person cannot be jailed simply for being unable to pay a fine. It is the kind of administrative detail that reads, in hindsight, like the hinge the entire tragedy turned on: a missed payment, a judge following the letter of a reasonable law, and a man who, weeks later, would be captured on camera, leading an 11-year-old girl away from a car wash. Detectives took Smith into custody within days of the abduction, initially booking him on the probation violation, while the broader investigation into Carlie's disappearance continued to build around him. He did not cooperate with questioning in any meaningful way in those early days, and for a family already living through the worst hours of their lives, the silence from the person they now suspected only stretched the waiting further. What they found, 4 days after Carlie vanished, 4 days of searchers combing scrubland, of volunteers papering the city with her photograph, of a community holding a kind of collective breath. Her body was discovered on the grounds of the Central Church of Christ on Proctor Road, roughly 3 miles from where she'd been taken. What the medical examiner later determined, laid out plainly in later court filings, was that Carlie had been sexually assaulted while she was still alive, and that she ultimately died of strangulation. This documentary won't dwell on the specific details of what she endured in those final hours, beyond what's necessary to understand the severity of the crime Smith was ultimately convicted of. There is nothing to be gained from lingering there, and everything to be said instead about who Carlie was, and about what happened in the search for justice that followed. Carlie was a 6th grader. Those who knew her described an ordinary, well-loved kid, the kind of description that recurs endlessly in cases like this one, not because it's a hollow phrase reporters reach for, but because it's almost always true. She had wanted, that Sunday evening, simply to get home in time to watch the Super Bowl with her family. The arrest and the case against Smith. By February 20th, less than 3 weeks after Carlie's disappearance, prosecutors had formally charged Smith with sexual battery of a child under 12, kidnapping, and first-degree murder. The speed of the charges reflected how much physical and circumstantial evidence investigators believed they already had in hand. Prosecutors built their case on a combination of pieces, each individually persuasive and, together, difficult to argue against. The surveillance footage itself, still the most recognizable piece of evidence in the case, the borrowed car, and the unaccounted-for hours. DNA and hair analysis evidence recovered from the scene, the testimony of co-workers and friends who told investigators they recognized Smith's build and movement in the video, and, according to prosecutors, an account from Smith's own brother describing a confession. Smith did not take the stand in his own defense. The trial began more than a year and a half after Carlie's murder, in the fall of 2005, and it drew the kind of sustained national media attention that few local Florida trials ever see, a direct continuation of the same public fixation the case had generated during the search itself. The video that had haunted the country for 2 days in February 2004 was played again for the jury, this time not as a plea for the public's help finding a stranger, but as evidence identifying the man sitting at the defense table. In November 2005, after about 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Joseph Smith guilty on all 3 counts: kidnapping, capital sexual battery, and first-degree murder. Carlie's relatives, seated in the courtroom, embraced and wept when the verdict was read. Her mother, Susan Shorpen, sat with her head bowed as the counts were announced one by one. Her father, Joe Brucia, nodded silently at each conviction. Smith himself, by most courtroom accounts, showed no visible reaction. Outside the courthouse, Shorpen spoke to reporters, and her words that day were carried by news outlets across the country. They captured, more than any legal summary could, the scale of what had been taken from her family. "I lost one of the most precious things to me in my life," she said, "because of an animal." The sentencing hearing. The trial's guilt phase was only the first half of the legal process. Under Florida law at the time, the same jury also had to recommend a sentence, death or life in prison, a recommendation the judge would then weigh, required by statute, to give it what the law described as great weight, before issuing his own final ruling. The jury recommended death, by a vote of 10-2. Before formal sentencing, in a hearing held the month prior, Smith addressed the court directly. Weeping, he told Circuit Judge Andrew Owens that on the day he abducted Carlie, he had taken large amounts of cocaine and heroin, hoping to overdose, an account of a suicide attempt gone catastrophically, unforgivably wrong for someone else. He described a heroin addiction stretching back to his teenage years, a marriage that had recently collapsed, and a life that had, by his own account, come apart entirely in the months leading up to that Sunday evening. "I do not ask for mercy for myself," he told the judge. "The only thing I can see to give me a life sentence is for my family. I do not want to see them hurt any further." It is worth being direct about what that statement was and wasn't. It was not an explanation that made sense of what he had done. Addiction and personal collapse are not uncommon. Countless people move through both without ever harming a child. What Smith chose to do to an 11-year-old girl on his way through his own collapse was his choice alone, and the court treated it as exactly that. In March 2006, Judge Owens formally sentenced Joseph Smith to death. Reading his ruling aloud, Owens described the scales of the case as tipping unquestionably toward that outcome, and returned to the lasting image the case had left behind. The same seconds of security footage that had once been broadcast nationwide in hopes of finding Carlie, now cited by a judge as evidence of the terror she must have felt in her final hour. Carlie's stepfather, Stephen Kanzler, was in the courtroom for the sentencing. Afterward, he told reporters the ruling didn't change what the family had lost, but that it mattered that Carlie had been heard. A courtroom that would not look away. Court personnel who worked the trial would later describe it as one of the most difficult cases many of them had handled in their careers, not because of any ambiguity in the evidence, but because of how completely ordinary the setting of the crime had been. A car wash, a shortcut home, a Sunday evening with a football game on in the background. There was no isolated back road, no unfamiliar part of town, just a stretch of pavement a child had walked dozens of times before. Detectives and crime scene technicians involved in the case have spoken since about the toll of working it, the specific weight of a case involving a child, compounded by a piece of video footage that never fully left the public's memory once it aired. For a lot of people who worked in and around the Sarasota County justice system in 2004, The Brucia case became a kind of before and after marker in their careers. That footage did more than solve the case. It changed how an entire generation of parents understood the speed and randomness with which a child could be taken from a place that, moments earlier, had looked completely safe. It's part of why the case is still taught, informally, in conversations about child safety and situational awareness 2 decades later, not because it offers a tidy lesson, but because it offers proof of how fast an ordinary evening can turn. The search itself. It's worth pausing on what those 4 days actually looked like on the ground, because the case is so often remembered as the one with the video, that the human scale of the search can get lost. Within hours of the Amber Alert, Sarasota's search effort had grown well past what local police could coordinate alone. Volunteers arrived by the hundreds. Neighbors, parents from Carlie's school, people who had never met the family but couldn't stay home once the footage started airing. They walked grid patterns through the scrubland and wooded lots that ring that part of Sarasota County, the kind of dense Florida underbrush that can swallow a search line whole if it isn't organized carefully. Search and rescue teams brought in dogs. Divers checked retention ponds and canals. Helicopters ran passes over undeveloped land near the car wash, and, as the search widened, over larger stretches of the county. Vigils formed almost immediately, the way they tend to in cases like this. Candles outside the car wash, ribbons tied along Bee Ridge Road, a makeshift memorial that grew day by day, even while the outcome was still, technically, unknown. There's a particular kind of tension that builds in a community during a search like this. Hope has to be maintained publicly, because withdrawing it feels like giving up on a child who might still be found alive, even as the days accumulate in a way that makes everyone privately brace for the worst. For the family, those 4 days were lived in the space between those two realities, coordinating with detectives, appearing in front of cameras to keep Carlie's face and name in front of the public, and waiting. It's a specific kind of endurance that doesn't show up in a case summary, and it's part of why, when the news finally came that Carlie's body had been found, so much of Sarasota experienced it less as new information and more as the confirmation of something the entire county had been quietly dreading since the second night. What the footage changed. Every generation of missing child cases has one that reshapes how the public and press cover the next one, and for a lot of true crime observers, the Brucia case is often pointed to as one of those pivots, less because of anything unique in the crime itself, tragically, and more because of what the surveillance footage did to the speed and shape of the coverage. Amber Alerts had existed for years by 2004, but they typically relied on descriptions: a height, a hair color, a make and model of car. What made this case different was that, for the first time on this scale, the public wasn't looking for a description. They were looking at the crime itself, replayed on a loop, with millions of people simultaneously trying to place a face that was never fully visible. It shifted the entire dynamic of public participation in an active investigation, turning ordinary viewers into a kind of crowdsourced identification network, days before that phrase would have meant anything to most people. It also permanently changed the footage's relationship to the case. Long after the trial ended, those few seconds remained the single image most people associate with Carlie Brucia, which is its own quiet tragedy, since it means the lasting public memory of an 11-year-old girl is built around the worst moment of her life, rather than any of the ordinary ones that came before it. Her family has spoken about that tension directly over the years. Gratitude that the footage helped bring her killer to justice, alongside grief that it's the image so many strangers carry, instead of a school photo or a memory of who she actually was. The long legal aftermath. For most true crime cases, a death sentence in 2006 would be close to the end of the story. For Smiths, it wasn't. In 2016, the United States Supreme Court ruled in an unrelated Florida case, Hearst v. Florida, that the state's death sentencing procedure was unconstitutional because it allowed a judge, rather than a unanimous jury, to make the ultimate factual findings needed to impose death. Florida's system at the time only required a jury recommendation, which in Smith's case had been 10-2, not unanimous. That ruling opened the door for appeals across a wave of Florida death row cases, and Smith's was one of them. In 2018, citing Hearst, the Florida Supreme Court vacated Smith's death sentence specifically because his jury's recommendation hadn't been unanimous, and ordered a new penalty phase. His convictions for murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery were not disturbed, only the sentence. The state pushed to reinstate the death penalty, and in April 2020, a circuit judge did resentence Smith to death. But further state Supreme Court rulings in other, similar cases called that resentencing into question as well. And by 2021, Florida's own Attorney General's office acknowledged that Smith's case needed to go back to the circuit court for yet another sentencing hearing. Joseph Brucia, Carlie's father, was blunt about what nearly 2 decades of legal reversals had done to the family's sense of closure. He described feeling let down by a system that had already failed his daughter once, when Smith was left free on probation instead of returned to custody, and was now failing her again through years of procedural delay. Smith died in the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections in July 2021 at age 55. While still on death row and still awaiting the resentencing hearing that might have converted his sentence to life in prison. A cause of death was not immediately released. He died, in other words, in the same unresolved legal limbo the case had been suspended in for years, sentenced to die, but never executed, and never finally resentenced either. Joseph Brucia's reaction, when reporters reached him, was unsparing. He said he felt the criminal justice system he'd come to see as inept and, in his words, corrupt, had failed to deliver an ending on its own, and that Smith's death in custody had, as he put it, taken care of what the system couldn't. Legacy, Carlie Brucia's murder, became one of the cases most directly cited by lawmakers pushing for tougher handling of probation violators in the years that followed. A direct line drawn between the fact that Smith was free at all that Sunday evening and the fine print of a probation system that had let a few $100s in unpaid fees stand between him and custody. That outrage took a concrete legislative shape. U.S. Representative Katherine Harris of Florida introduced federal legislation, informally referred to at the time as Carlie's Law, aimed at expanding the reasons a convicted offender on federal probation could be sent back to prison, including adding violent felonies and child sex crimes to that list. A narrower version of the bill ultimately passed, though it ended up limited specifically to sex offenders. There's a bitter irony in that. Smith himself had no prior sex offense conviction before Carlie's murder, meaning the law that bore her case's imprint wouldn't necessarily have applied to a man exactly like him. Susan Shorpen spent years afterward as a visible advocate for stronger protections for children and tougher accountability for repeat offenders, telling reporters plainly, again and again, that the system that allowed Smith to remain free needed to change so that no other family would live through what hers did. Carlie Brucia would be in her early 30s today. She isn't. What's left instead is a piece of surveillance footage that a generation of parents still remember watching in real time. A family that spent 2 decades split between advocacy and an exhausting legal fight that never fully closed. And a case that changed, in concrete and measurable ways, how seriously parts of the legal system talk about the gap between a probation violation on paper and the danger a person can still pose while free. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. We'll see you in the next one.